Hi.
Hi, I'm Kim Robinson, the editorial director at UC Press, and I'm here with Naomi Paik, author of Bans, Walls, Raids, Sanctuary, Understanding U.S. Immigration for the 21st Century. Naomi, thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So before we get started, I wanted to just quickly introduce Naomi and this powerful book, which I've been enjoying reading. Naomi is Associate Professor of Asian American Studies at the University of Illinois. And in addition to authoring the book we'll be discussing today, she's also the author of Rightlessness, Testimony and Redress in U.S. Prison Camps Since World War II. So days after taking the White House, Donald Trump signed 3 executive orders. These authorized the Muslim ban, the border wall, and ICE raids. These orders would define the administration's approach toward non-citizens. An essential primer on how we got here, Bans, Walls, Raids, Sanctuary, shows that barriers to immigration, such as Trump's border wall, ICE raids, and the Muslim ban, are embedded in the very foundation of the United States. Naomi Paik reveals that the 45th president's xenophobic, racist, ableist, patriarchal ascendancy is no aberration, but the consequence of 2 centuries of US political, economic, and social culture. These attacks against migrants are tightly bound to assaults against women, people of color, workers, ill and disabled people, and queer and gender nonconforming people. Against this history of barriers and assaults, Bans, Walls, Raids, Sanctuary mounts a rallying cry for a broad-based abolitionist sanctuary movement for all. So Naomi, can you start us off by telling us about the motivating factors for writing your book and who the key audience is?
Sure. So I've been working on issues of immigration and incarceration for a long time now, but the motivating factor for this book in particular, no surprise, is the 2016 election and the Donald Trump seizure of the White House. And so, you know, I don't think it was shocking. Like I could see how it could happen, but I also did not think it could happen. I think I share that with many other people. But when it was clear that he was going to be the president, I think seeing a lot of the kind of years by his campaign, and then also the mass mobilizations that were rallying against to contest everything that he and his campaign stood for were the motivating factors behind this. And so in 2017, you know, within a few weeks of taking office, he passed those 3 executive orders. Yeah. And so what I'm trying to get at is that on the one hand, Trump kind of crystallizes and condenses these really long histories, right? So the argument of the book is, you know, the problem is not Donald Trump. The problem is the United States of America. So if we're gonna get real about contesting and challenging everything he represents and then his whole anti-immigrant, racist, patriarchal platform, then we have to get at those deeper roots. We can't just focus on getting him out of office, right? We have to actually challenge what are the social conditions that produced him and made his campaign so relevant to so many people. And so the audience that I'm looking to communicate to is a really wide range of people. So I'm talking to everyone from seasoned organizers who have been doing this work day in, day out for much longer than before Trump even entered the political stage, as well as people who are kind of newly awoken to how bad things are. So like just regular, ordinary people who know things are really terrible, but they don't know how we got here and they don't know what to do about it. And everyone in between. So like faith leaders, teachers, students. I'm trying to really think about how do we analyze these deep shared foundations of mutually constituted oppressions, and then what does that mean for what we're gonna do about it?
Yeah, well, it was really accessibly written, and I think, you know, really a useful tool for all of those audiences. And it, you know, you lead right into my first question, which is about the fact that Trump's racist policies around immigration are not new or unique, considering the history of immigration policy in the US. And some people might find that surprising given that we understand ourselves as a nation of immigrants.
Mhm.
So can you tell us a bit more about that and what you see as the roots of this legacy that Trump is building on?
Right. And I first want to acknowledge like how powerful the nation of immigrants narrative is. Even my own family came to this country, and not just like my parents, but my aunties and uncles came to this country in part because they were drawn in by that narrative. And many of us believe that we have lived out the promise of the American dream and of the nation of immigrants, right? But I think it's also important to understand that my family members came to this country in the aftermath of war and a decimated economy that was rebuilt under a capitalist authoritarian regime that was also supported by the United States. So both of these things can be true at the same time. The power of that nation of immigrant narrative and the real history of US empire, right? That ultimately both drew different people to the United States. And my own family is not unique in this way at all, right? I think many immigrants come to this country because of those kind of really complicated histories, right? So I do want to acknowledge how powerful the nation of immigrants narrative is, but at the same time, we really need to challenge and criticize it and think about the ways that that narrative kind of papers over and obscures other histories of the United States Foundation. So the two that I kind of situate the book in are, first of all, US settler colonialism, right? And then also the 19th century origins of immigration restriction. So if we go all the way back to the founding of the United States and settler colonialism, which sought not only to destroy and replace indigenous people and cultures and societies, but also to exclude and remove people who don't quite fit into the US ideal of a settler society. So like people of color, enslaved African people, women. I mean, basically anyone who has not been defined by whiteness, property ownership, health, and ability, among many other factors, right? So we have to deal with that, right? And the other kind of thread that I'm situating this long history in it is the history of immigration exclusion, which is absolutely from the very beginning rooted in racist, patriarchal exclusions, right? So some of our first federal immigration laws were designed to exclude Chinese women and workers, right? And then just a couple months later, those exclusions expanded to include poor people, ill people, and disabled people, right? So it's like all of these things have been working together from the very beginning of immigration exclusions and from the very foundations of the US, right? And we also have to think about how the nation of immigrants narrative has not always welcomed all immigrants, right? It hasn't been embracing any immigrant from any situation, right? Some immigrants have always been cast as trespassers, right? As people who kind of came in the wrong way or something like that, and whose mere presence is thus seen as being illegal just by being here. And so I think it's important for us to like keep these different kinds of tensions in mind, right? So even as we find or as many people find the nation of immigrant story very seductive and very appealing, I think it also makes more sense to understand how immigration is foundational structured in unequal relationships, not only within the United States, but the United States relationship to the rest of the world as well, right? So it's always implicated in imperialism and things like this. And so rather than demanding inclusion into a nation of immigrants that is fundamentally rooted in inequality, maybe we need to contest that narrative altogether.
I thought it was interesting the way that when you talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act or different things, the tension between it is a racist policy, but also as an economic policy, controlling labor forces and being interested in these different populations as capitalist, tools, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, I think, okay, so capitalism cannot exist without unequal social relations. That's like, some people have stuff, other people's means of production, other people's labor for it. It is based fundamentally on unequal power relationships, right? And you cannot extricate the history of capitalism from the history of US racism and imperialism. It's just not actually possible. And so the book kind of talks about some of the political economy, right, that's undergirding some of the policy shifts that specifically might be targeting immigrants or not foreign-born people, but are actually rooted in kind of a political economic structure that affects way more people than just immigrants, right? That immigrants are one piece of this much larger kind of foundational structure.
And what would be an example of that? I know you talked a lot about the building of the wall and the history between Mexico and the way that that labor and population has been viewed in different periods.
Right. So, you know, thinking about the wall, so the idea of a border wall is also not new. It's not innovated by Trump. We've had, you know, several hundred miles of wall before he even got to office. So this is not a new thing. But I think when we see kind of border controls, including our kind of the first initiations of wall building, we see that it's absolutely related to things like free trade agreements, right, in North America, like with NAFTA, right, and thinking about how the expansion of US capitalism and getting the state out of the way of the free flow of goods and the free flow of investment capital, how that ultimately displaces lots of people from places of the world like Mexico and Central America, right? And so, so I talk a lot about the book, how these economic forces kind of work together, right? How the taking away of trade barriers and protective taxes that protected the Mexican agricultural economy. When you take those protections away, what do you expect? You know, the agricultural economy of Mexico then takes a really devastating, shocking hit, right? What then happens to all the people who work in that industry? You've taken away the grounds of their livelihoods, right? So it is then no surprise that you then see increases in migration to follow capital, right? And it's also at that point where you see increasingly hardened demands for border security, right? So we have at the same time this kind of demand that capital and goods have free movement, and also that we lock down the movement of human mobility.
But there seems to be an advantage to people hiring undocumented immigrants because of the extended control they have over them.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, immigration policy also works as labor discipline, for sure. And so one of the reasons why immigrant labor is seen as more attractive from the perspective of capital is that it's a well-disciplined workforce, right? So you can pay them less because they might not have documentation, or, you know, they might not, you can use kind of the threat of deportation to disrupt any kind of labor organizing for worker safety, for higher wages, for anything like that. And so it works to discipline that labor force. It is also the case that because of you know, the reduced costs that are of manufacturing goods and everything like that, because of a globalized economy, businesses, capital in the United States is also pressured to lower its costs as much as possible, right? And so they are incentivized to find the cheapest, most tractable labor force possible. So they will actually recruit workers not from the United States, but they will recruit directly into places like Mexico, right? And pull them into the United States so that they can lower their costs and therefore be competitive on a global market, right? So all of these things are really embedded, or like entangled with each other.
It's so helpful to see the interlinking forces in this, because I think it deepens our understanding that it isn't just a new policy. It isn't just with the advent of ICE, for instance, that's not where it begins.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so it's not in the book, but when I'm teaching things that are things in the book, I often use these political cartoons that show, you know, like a Chinese wall coming down, like the Chinese wall coming down around China, but then in the US building up an anti-Chinese wall. So both of these things go together. It's like we want access to the Chinese market and goods, and this goes back to the 19th century, right? But we don't want the migration of Chinese laborers coming over here once we feel like they've become a social menace, right? And so these kind of relationships are not new to late capitalism, but actually go much, much further back.
Yeah. So your book calls for an abolitionist sanctuary movement in response. So could you outline for us what that approach would look like?
Yes. So the first 3 chapters basically historicize the history of bans, walls, and raids. And then the 4th chapter on sanctuary it's kind of like a manifesto a little bit in terms of calling for a different approach to sanctuary movements, ones that abandon kind of any kind of liberal attachments that sanctuary has had to, you know, like the nation of immigrants, or to including the good immigrants who didn't do anything wrong, et cetera, and like kind of letting go of those kind of distinctions between the good immigrant who has a family and who doesn't, they might not have papers, but they don't commit crimes, etc. And then bad immigrants who might be, you know, involved in small crimes or things like that, and therefore their deportations are justifiable, right? So it abandons any kind of logic that leaves anyone behind, right? And so I think an abolitionist approach to sanctuary kind of combines strategies and concepts that might not seem to go together, like abolition and sanctuary. Sanctuary seems very defensive, like protecting someone from imminent harm, right? And abolition is about tearing down oppressive structures and building a new world in its place. But I'm actually saying that there are certain kinds of overlaps between the 2 concepts that I think we can kind of lean into and foster, right? So both share a commitment to taking care of each other and leaving no one behind. So if we think about the millennia old concepts of sanctuary, it is about a radical welcome of anyone without exception, including people like murderers, like people who did really break the social contract, right? But still believing that everyone is worth protecting. And so I think that combining these 2 kinds of concepts can be really powerful for an immigrant justice movement that is not strictly about just immigrant liberation, right? But it's about really thinking about if all of these political, economic, and social structures for all kinds of oppressed people are shared and they come from certain kinds of shared foundations, then you can't really fight for one group of people without fighting for everyone else. That our shared path together, if we're all gonna get towards a different kind of transformed world where everybody has what they need to thrive, that we have to do it all together. That doesn't mean you can't focus and find your lane, right? But like you can't do it to the exclusion of other kinds of people, right? And so it's not like liberation for or inclusion for immigrants, but you know, prisons and jails and policing are okay for everyone else, right? Well, that's not what we're talking about.
Let's continue that vein. And so there are a lot of headlines right now about abolishing the police. And so can you explain how, in particular around the police and the criminal justice system, your views on abolition fit with these similar arguments?
Yeah, they totally come out of those arguments. And I think, you know, it's not like I am, like I'm looking at things that are already in motion. So immigrant justice movements that are already thinking in abolitionist terms, right? And are already thinking as intersectionally as possible, and are thinking, aligning the movement, for example, to abolish ICE and to abolish CBP or Customs and Border Protection with the movements, the much longer standing movements of abolishing police and prisons, right? And so I think that a lot of the theorizing, the struggles over, the fight for that radically transformed world that abolitionists have been calling for has really provided us with so many rich conceptual tools as well as organizing tools that some of which are very portable to other kinds of movements, including immigrant justice movements. And so I think, you know, really thinking about how the effort to tear down structures of state violence, right? Police, prisons, surveillance, immigrant detention, deportation, how all of them are mutually constituted, right? The criminalization of immigrants and foreign-born people rose up together with the criminalization of poor people, of Black people, of mentally ill people, of unhoused people, and so on and so on, right? So that means if those structures are shared, then our strategies can be shared as well, right? And so I think that, I think what we're seeing right now is like a really insurrectionary moment that is incredibly exciting, and that we can all kind of continue to push for, you know, the defunding and the dismantling of police forces and prisons, and also thinking about the dismantling and defunding of ICE, which is a very young organization. It has not existed that long, right? And thinking about also dismantling structures of US imperialism. So thinking about dismantling structures of the US military industrial complex, right? Yeah. And so all of these things really go together.
So when you call for, you know, you describe it as a manifesto, and you must be talking to students who must feel a little overwhelmed by where to find their lane, as you described it. Like, you know, you can't solve every problem simultaneously. And so understanding the context and the connections is important. But then how do you talk them through finding their lane?
I mean, I think it's about finding who, like, where are you? Like, where are you situated, right? And so I talk with other friends about this too, who are kind of really, you know, maybe especially since the election, and then also in recent weeks. Right? What is my lane? Well, then where are you right now? Are you a healthcare worker? You know, I work in education. So like, that's kind of, I feel like my lane is about working both within these institutions of higher education, but then also contesting them when they don't do right by community and people, right? So like, where are you situated? What resources do you have available to you right now? If you're a young person, that means you have probably lots of young friends, that you have a kind of awareness and ability to use social media in a way that, you know, some like older folks might not have that kind of dexterity, right? You might have other kinds of resources. You might have family resources and family stories and narratives that you can use to contest mainstream dominant narratives that have been used to oppress people, right? So where are you? Like, what resources do you have? And then how can you use the resources that you have to kind of, and move it in the direction of what's already going on, right? You don't have to start something new from scratch. There's a lot of organizations, a lot of different means by which you can get involved. So it's really just about finding where can you be most effective, right? And where can you like, use what you have at your disposal already.
I love how you define the resources as their own stories too. That's really powerful and can make a valuable contribution.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that if you listen to a lot of immigrant justice organizers, especially among undocumented people, I think that changing the narrative around what it means to be undocumented is absolutely crucial, right? So that, you know, like the narrative of coming out of the shadows, right? I think was a powerful way of thinking about, you know, I'm not gonna be made to be afraid because I lack a certain kind of documentation. Like, I'm here, I am accountable to everyone around me, and I want you to be accountable to me too. And then kind of shifting the way we think about how we relate to each other is absolutely crucial work. So all of this work has to happen on multiple levels, right? But I think that re-narrativization, right, about what is possible is really important. And I think we're seeing that happen really quickly in real time right now, right? Like, it is, you know, thinking about, you know, defunding or abolishing the police maybe even 6 months ago would not have resonated the way it does now. Right? But people are actually seeing, why are we investing 40% of our city's budget in solutions that have proven over the last 40 decades, or like 4 decades, not to work, but to actually make the problem worse? Like, why are we doing that? Maybe we should try something else, right?
Well, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation. I think that your book is making an enormous contribution to this work. So I just want to hold it up again and say that Bans, Walls, Raids, and Sanctuary is on sale in print and digital forms. And we want to encourage people to purchase it through bookshop.org or IndieBound to support independent booksellers. And you can find that link on the UC Press page. So thank you so much, Naomi. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed working with your press all this whole time. So thank you so much.
Thank you.